I was standing on the 14th floor of my latest high-rise project in the heart of Atlanta. The wind was whipping against my face with a fierce intensity, but my heart was as still as a mountain lake. From this height, the city looked like a chessboard where I had finally learned how to play every piece. I looked down at my hands. They were not the soft hands of a woman who spent her days in a spa. These were hands that had been calloused by gravel dust and the weight of steel beams. Every scar on my palms was a badge of honor earned in exchange for million-dollar contracts and a reputation that commanded respect in a male-dominated industry. I felt powerful. I felt in control of my destiny for the first time in 32 years. Then the peace was shattered by the vibrating buzz of my phone. I expected it to be my foreman, or perhaps a high-stakes partner closing our latest deal. Instead, the screen displayed the name Sasha. My younger sister was a self-proclaimed lifestyle curator on Instagram, which was really just a fancy way of saying she was unemployed and lived in a world of filters and lies. Sasha did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how my day was going or if I was busy managing a construction site. Her voice came through the speaker like a sharp blade. She told me that I needed to have my $4.5 million beach house in Destin cleaned and ready by Friday. She said she was hosting a family reunion there over the weekend and expected everything to be perfect. As she spoke, a wave of bitter memories flooded my mind. I remembered being 19 years old. While other girls were enjoying their youth, I was working 2 grueling jobs. I spent my days as a receptionist and my nights cleaning office buildings until my back felt like it would snap. I lived on instant noodles for months, skipping meals, just to ensure I had enough money to pay for Sasha's private school tuition. I sacrificed my comfort so she could have a future. Meanwhile, she was stealing money from my purse to buy designer shoes and expensive handbags. She had spent my hard-earned sweat on vanity while I was starving. Now, years later, she still looked at my success as her personal playground. She did not see my house as a result of my labor. She saw it as hers to take. I had barely disconnected the call from Sasha when my phone vibrated again. I did not even have time to take a breath of the thin air up here on the 14th floor. This time, the caller ID displayed Mama Pearl. My heart sank because I knew exactly what was coming. In our community, the mothers are the keepers of the peace, but in my family, Mama Pearl was the enforcer of an unfair status quo. She did not ask if I was tired from managing a multi-million-dollar construction site. She did not ask if I had eaten lunch. Instead, her voice arrived with that heavy, rhythmic tone she used when she was about to lay a burden on my shoulders. She told me that Zora, the Lord has blessed you so that you can share with others. She warned me not to let my wealth turn my heart into a cold stone. She told me that family must always come before anything else. Mama Pearl was playing the only card she knew how to use against me. She was using our faith and our history as a weapon to force my hand. She began to recount the stories of our ancestors who labored in the hot sun of the Deep South. She spoke about the long line of women in our family who had nothing but their dignity and their prayers. She reminded me that I was standing on their shoulders and that my success was a victory for the entire bloodline. It was a beautiful sentiment on the surface, but I knew the hidden price tag. She was invoking the black tax, that unwritten law that says, once you make it out of the struggle, you are financially responsible for everyone you left behind. She made it sound like my refusal to let Sasha trash my house was a betrayal of my heritage. I felt a familiar sense of suffocation as she spoke. It was the weight of 1,000 expectations pressing down on my chest. I love my mother, but her definition of family was a one-way street where I gave and everyone else took. She ignored the fact that I had already spent over $50,000 in the last 2 years just to keep Sasha out of debt. To Mama Pearl, my bank account was a communal well that should never run dry. She wanted me to be the savior of the family while letting Sasha remain a professional victim. I stood there looking out over the skyline of Atlanta, feeling like a prisoner in a suit of gold. The guilt she was trying to shove down my throat was thick and bitter. I realized then that my success had not bought me freedom. It had only made me a bigger target for their entitlement. I was still reeling from the manipulation of Mama Pearl when my phone chimed with a priority notification. It was from Tyrell, my most trusted assistant, and the only person who kept his ear to the ground while I kept my eyes on the sky. He had sent me a link to a private group on a luxury travel platform, along with a message that told me to look at this immediately. I clicked the link and felt the blood drain from my face as a wave of cold fury washed over me. Sasha was not planning a quiet family dinner or a simple weekend of bonding. She had created an entire marketing campaign titled the Sasha Luxury Retreat Experience. The website featured high-resolution photos of my private beach house in Destin, photos she must have taken while I was away on business. The betrayal was documented in plain black and white. My sister was selling tickets for $1,500 per person. She had already sold out 30 slots to complete strangers who thought they were buying a piece of high society living. I did the math in my head, and the number hit me like a physical blow. She had collected $45,000 by selling access to my sanctuary. This was not a misunderstanding or a cry for help. This was a calculated and criminal exploitation of my hard work. Sasha was treating my private life like a commodity to be traded for her own profit. She was using my success to fund a lifestyle she had never earned. As I scrolled through the event details, my anger intensified. She was promising these 30 strangers that they would have full access to my personal wine cellar, including the vintage bottles I had been saving for special milestones. She even had the audacity to offer a diamond tier package where the guest could sleep in the master bedroom, which was my own private bed. The thought of strangers lounging in my silk sheets and drinking my rare vintages made my skin crawl. This had crossed every line of human decency. It was no longer a family dispute about boundaries or being a good sister. Sasha had turned into a predator, and my home was the prey. She was committing fraud on a massive scale and using my name to do it. The realization settled in my chest like a heavy stone. I had spent years protecting her and shielding her from the harsh realities of the world, only for her to turn around and rob me while smiling to her followers. I looked back at the city of Atlanta from my 14th floor vantage point and knew that the time for being the nice sister was over. This was a crime pure and simple. Sasha was not just a spoiled sibling anymore, she was a criminal who had mistaken my silence for weakness. I closed the link and called Terrell back, my voice as hard as the steel beams surrounding me. I told him to gather every receipt and prepare for a war. I held the phone with a trembling hand, my knuckles white as I dialed Pop Silas. In my heart, I still carried the little girl who believed her father was the ultimate judge of fairness, a man of quiet strength who had taught me the value of a hard day of work. I expected him to be outraged by Sasha and her scheme. I expected him to protect the daughter who had bought him his retirement truck and paid for his bypass surgery. But when he answered, his voice was not filled with shock. It was heavy with a defensive irritation that made my stomach churn. I asked him directly how Sasha planned to get into my house without a key. There was a long, suffocating silence before he finally admitted the truth. He confessed that he had given his spare set of keys to Sasha 2 days ago. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest, sharper than any insult Sasha could ever hurl. That key was given to him for emergencies, a symbol of my absolute trust in him. When I asked him why he would violate my privacy and my safety, like that, Pop Silas did not apologize. Instead, he exploded into a fit of rage that echoed through the receiver. He shouted that I was being selfish and cold. He told me that I owned 3 massive houses, while my own sister had nothing to her name. He yelled that as the eldest daughter, it was my sacred duty to lift her up and provide her with opportunities. He barked that I should not be guarding a pile of bricks and stones like a greedy dragon guarding a hoard of gold. He said that Sasha was just trying to make something of herself and that I was the one standing in her way. His words cut through me, stripping away the last of my illusions. I realized in that moment that to my parents, I was no longer a human being with feelings, needs, or a right to my own property. I was not their daughter, Zora, the girl who had worked herself to the bone to make them proud. I was simply a bottomless automated teller machine, an endless source of funds and assets to be redistributed according to their whims. They viewed my success not as a result of my sacrifice, but as a communal family resource that I had no right to control. The man I had looked up to for 32 years was telling me that my hard work belonged to a sister who had never lifted a finger to help anyone but herself. The weight of the black tax was no longer just a financial burden, it was an emotional cage. Pop Silas was willing to sacrifice my security and my peace of mind to satisfy Sasha's greed, all under the guise of family unity. I stood on that 14th floor surrounded by the skeletal frame of my new building and felt completely alone. I realized that if I did not protect myself, no one else would. My own father had handed over the keys to my sanctuary to a thief. I took a deep breath, my heart hardening into something as cold and unbreakable as the steel beams around me. I told him that he had made a grave mistake, and then I hung up the phone before he could say another word. It was Saturday morning when I pulled my car onto the long gravel driveway of my sanctuary in Destin. The sun was beating down on the Emerald Coast, but the heat inside my chest was far more intense than the Florida sun. As I rounded the final bend, my heart nearly stopped. A massive, gleaming luxury tour bus was parked crookedly across my entrance, blocking the path. The gate, which I had spent $12,000 to custom design with reinforced steel, was hanging off its hinges like a broken toy. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my fingers tingle against the steering wheel. I stepped out of the car, and the scene that met my eyes was nothing short of a nightmare. There were 30 strangers scattered across my property. People I had never seen in my life were lounging in my designer patio chairs and splashing in my infinity pool. They were holding crystal cocktail glasses, the very ones I had imported from Italy, and I could see the condensation dripping onto my hand-finished teak tables. Even worse, a group of them was dancing and stomping on the rare zoysia grass that I had spent months nurturing with a professional landscaper. The air was filled with the smell of expensive perfume and the loud, obnoxious bass of a portable speaker. It looked like a music video set, but the budget for this production was being stolen directly from my soul. In the center of this chaos stood Sasha. She was wearing a floor-length silk dress that probably cost more than a month of my mortgage, and she was holding a microphone connected to the speaker system. She was laughing and spinning around her phone held high on a gimbal as she live-streamed the entire event to her followers. I heard her voice booming across the lawn telling everyone to welcome themselves to her humble abode. She told the crowd that she had worked so hard to acquire this piece of paradise and that she wanted to share her success with all of them. She was soaking up the admiration of these strangers, feeding off their envy like a parasite. When her eyes finally met mine, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated terror cross her face. Her hand wobbled for a fraction of a second, and the gimbal dipped. But Sasha was a professional liar, and she recovered faster than a snake in the grass. She plastered a fake, sugary smile on her face and waved me over as if I were a stray dog that had wandered onto her porch. She spoke into the microphone, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. She told the group that everyone should look, because her big sister had finally arrived. She told the 30 guests that I was there to help with the catering and to make sure their drinks stayed full for the rest of the afternoon. The crowd laughed, and a few people actually held out their empty glasses toward me. I stood there rooted to the spot as the sheer audacity of her disrespect settled into my bones. She had not only stolen my home, she was now attempting to steal my dignity in front of an audience. Before I could even open my mouth to reclaim my own property, Darnell stepped into my personal space. Darnell was Sasha's husband, a man who had spent most of his adult life looking for shortcuts while I was out in the sun building an empire. He was a large man, standing over 6 feet tall, and he used his physical shadow to try and swallow my resolve. He moved close enough that I could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath, the very bourbon he had likely stolen from my private collection. He leaned down, his eyes narrowed into slits, and he spoke in a low, menacing whisper that was meant only for my ears. He told me to keep my mouth shut and to play along with the charade. He warned me that they had a lot of money riding on this event, and that if I did anything to ruin their business deal, I would live to regret it. He was trying to bully me into submission in my own front yard, assuming that because I was a woman, I would buckle under the weight of his intimidation. But Darnell had forgotten one very important thing about me. I did not build skyscrapers by being intimidated by loud men with empty pockets. I did not move an inch. I looked him dead in the eye with a coldness that seemed to catch him off guard. I did not waste my breath arguing with a parasite. Instead, I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, decisive wave toward the entrance of the driveway. On that signal, 2 black SUVs belonging to a private security firm I had hired earlier that morning came roaring up the path, their tires kicking up gravel. Right behind them were 2 local police cruisers with their blue and red lights flashing, slicing through the afternoon haze. The music died instantly, and the crowd of 30 strangers froze as the officers stepped out of their vehicles. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I withdrew the original deed to the house, the gold seal of the county clerk shimmering in the sunlight. I held it high above my head so that every single person on my lawn, every camera lens, and every lying family member could see it. My voice rang out across the property with the authority of a judge passing a sentence. I told the crowd that this was not a party, and it certainly was not a family reunion. I informed them that they had been sold a lie by a pair of con artists. I declared that this property was my private residence, and that every person standing on this grass was currently committing criminal trespass and participating in a massive fraud. I looked directly at Sasha and Darnell as the police began to move toward them. I told the guests that they had exactly 10 minutes to gather their belongings and get back on that bus before they were all processed into the local county jail. The look of smug superiority on Darnell's face vanished, replaced by a pale mask of fear, as he realized that his physical threats meant nothing against the absolute power of the law. As the metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the humid Florida air, Darnell was led away toward the patrol car. The sight of her husband in custody broke Sasha's facade of arrogance. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the grass, her silk dress spreading out around her like a dying flower. She began to wail with an intensity that seemed rehearsed for a daytime soap opera. She looked up at me, her eyes streaming with tears that were carefully managed not to ruin her expensive mascara. She screamed at the top of her lungs, asking me if I was really going to send my own pregnant sister to jail. She called me a cold-blooded monster and a traitor to our family. The crowd of 30 strangers who had been silent until now began to whisper and mutter among themselves. Several people raised their phones, recording the dramatic scene for social media. I could feel the tide of public opinion shifting as they looked at me with judgment, seeing a wealthy woman bullying a vulnerable, expectant mother. I did not flinch, and I did not let the performance sway my heart. I had expected her to play this final desperate card. I reached into my leather handbag and slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a receipt that Tyrell had managed to intercept from the trash of a high-end medical spa in downtown Atlanta. I unfolded the paper and stepped closer to Sasha, looking down at her as she continued her theatrical display. I waited for a brief moment of silence before I spoke, ensuring that every phone camera was focused on my face. I asked her quite clearly how it was possible that she was pregnant when I was holding a detailed invoice from this past Thursday morning. I read the charges aloud for everyone to hear. The bill was for $2,400, covering a full session of Botox injections and dermal fillers for her entire face. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes and asked her what kind of reputable doctor would ever agree to inject those toxins into the body of a pregnant woman. I pointed out that medical professionals strictly forbid such cosmetic procedures for expectant mothers due to the severe risks to the fetus. The whispering in the crowd stopped instantly. The people who were filming her with sympathy now zoomed in on her perfectly smooth, frozen forehead and her unnaturally plump lips. The lie was exposed in the most humiliating way possible, right in front of the audience she had worked so hard to impress. Sasha's sobbing stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. The realization that her most potent weapon of guilt had been neutralized by a simple piece of paper left her speechless. The strangers she had scammed began to shout at her, realizing that every part of her life was a calculated deception. She was no longer a victim, and I was no longer the villain. She was just a fraud whose vanity had finally provided the evidence of her own undoing. I watched as the officers helped her to her feet, her silk dress stained with the dirt of the lawn she had tried to steal. The truth was bare for all to see, and for the first time in my life, the weight of her lies no longer felt like my burden to carry. The dust had barely settled on the driveway when another car screeched to a halt behind the police cruisers. Mama Pearl and Pop Silas scrambled out of the vehicle, their faces twisted with a mix of panic and righteous indignation. They did not run to me to ask if I was all right after being threatened by Darnell. Instead, they rushed straight to the patrol car where Sasha was being held. Mama Pearl began to wail about the shame this would bring to our family name in the church and the community. She turned to me with fire in her eyes and demanded that I tell the officers it was all a big misunderstanding. She insisted that I withdraw the charges immediately and use my own money to post bail for Sasha and Darnell. Pop Silas stepped forward, his voice gruff and commanding, as if he still held authority over my life. He told me that I needed to hand over $45,000 right now to refund those 30 strangers. He said it was the only way to save our reputation and keep the family from being the subject of town gossip. He spoke as if my bank account was a communal bucket and I was just the servant holding the handle. They were not asking me for a favor, they were demanding that I pay for the crimes committed against me. They wanted me to finance the very lies that had stripped me of my peace. I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the heavy tug of guilt. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I looked Mama Pearl and Pop Silas directly in their eyes and spoke with a voice that was as steady as a heartbeat. I told them that I had spent my entire adult life building a foundation for this family. I reminded them that I was the one who had bought the house they currently lived in and paid every single one of their medical bills. But then I issued a final warning. I told them that if they chose to use the roof I provided to harbor a criminal and cover up a fraud, I would take it all back. I declared that my generosity had officially reached its expiration date. I told them that from this moment on, they were no longer my responsibility. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I turned my back on their protests and walked into my house, locking the door behind me. Within 30 days, I had sold that beach house for $5 million and transferred the deed to a buyer who would never know my name. I took my phone and performed a digital execution. I blocked every single family member, changed my primary number, and deleted the social media accounts that they used to track my success. I packed my life into a few suitcases and moved across the country to a quiet vineyard in Napa Valley. Now I sit on my porch as the sun dips below the rolling hills of Northern California. I am holding a glass of deep red Cabernet, watching the orange light dance across the vines. There is no buzzing phone, no demands for money, and no emotional blackmail. I am surrounded by a silence that is more valuable than any skyscraper I have ever built. It is a silence I paid for with my youth, my sweat, and my tears. I take a slow sip of the wine and close my eyes. This is the harvest I have finally earned for myself. It tastes like victory. It tastes like freedom. Kendra's story serves as a powerful reminder that shared DNA is not a license for exploitation. It teaches us that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of self-preservation. When generosity is met with entitlement and theft, the only healthy response is a locked gate. We learn that enabling toxic family members only delays their inevitable crash. Sometimes you have to let them fall to force them to stand on their own. True freedom comes when you realize you are not responsible for financing the delusions of others.